1 week season.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 14, this edition of Bias Check. I am here in my living room, family room, with the Christmas tree, with the red on, getting ready for the Christmas season. So merry early Christmas season to everyone. And let's start again, making our one week season come true this week, and winning some tournaments. So I've always been tracking running back usage this year. Running back ownership this year, and the points that are being accumulated by the top 10 owned players at the running back position. What I have found is that it is very rare that a running back outside of that top 10 in ownership makes an impact on the slate. And I've been tracking which ones have been, and looking kind of through some of the patterns there. So I just wanted to check in. Why is this a part of Bias Check? The running back position in fantasy football in DFS this year is a little bit unique in the sense that it is extremely important that you get the running backs right, that you hit some of the running backs, as I went over in recent weeks, have been hitting for the highest scores. They are really the ones that you have to have, at least through up into the season so far. It used to be in the flex that you really needed to have a running back in there in order to be competitive, in order to win, because they were putting up all the high scores. As prices have gotten higher, the value has sort of faded at the running back position. We have sort of lost that edge, at least in the flex position, but still the two running back positions are extremely important. And I think there is an ability to limit your need to make decisions. The decision-making process is filled with bias. So anytime we can sort of ease our decision-making process or eliminate the biases there, that is a positive effect. It's going to be having a positive effect on our lineups and their ability to compete for first place. So a couple of things just at the running back position. Let's check in there first. Let's figure out what we need to keep in mind as we're getting ready for this week's slate in terms of running back. All right. Again, there is no need to look outside of the top 10 in ownership. Another thing we are seeing is that the high-priced running backs, they may be, projected for ownership that puts them in the top 10, but the really high-priced guys, the 9K and above guys, often are coming in at lower ownership than is predicted. This is happening mostly, of course, with CMC and Jonathan Taylor, the two guys that are priced up there. It happens mostly when they are in perceived difficult matchups, but I think we can expect that if one of those two is in the top 10 in ownership this week, I guess if Jonathan Taylor is up there this week, then he will be less owned than he is being projected for. I think that's an interesting thing to think about before ownership comes out. So what can we? Let's look at the table here. I sort of have it up on my screen. I'm just going to kind of talk through a few of the more recent developments. It used to be that we'd have about 4 or 5 running backs in that top 10 of ownership that were helping us on any given slate. So you could, there's lots of strategies when there are 4 or 5 out of the top 10 that are doing that. Recently, it's been more like 3 out of the top 10. You kind of need to hit on 2 out of those 3 in order to win tournaments. And if you haven't been doing that, right, you haven't been finishing high or winning tournaments. So that's important to know on these 10-game, 11-game slates. We're probably only going to get 2 or 3 in that top 10. And then another thing to note is that it is rare on any given week that we get a sub 1% owned, right, or a running back that's outside of this top 10 to contribute. But it has been the sort of sub 1% owned running backs that have been putting up big scores. Recently, we had Tucker, Gainwell, was that Kenneth Walker, Derrick Henry. Well, Derrick Henry was at 2% that week. The rest were sub 1% owned, put up scores of 37, 29, 20, and 23. Last week, we had a near zero owned Chuba Hubbard. He only put up 20, so that's not really all that much worth tracking. It's really the guys down there who put up 25, 30 points that are important. So, right, the running back position, how can we take action on this? Well, again, we want to make these decisions simpler. So we can look at the ownership predictions and use that as early as they come out, right? I'll start looking at who is in that top 10 of expected ownership. What I will do is, again, kind of take a look, especially at the top guys, because they won't move much. There will be a lot of movement between Friday and Sunday in ownership. And so it's okay, again, to kind of look at the pricing structure in there, look at the different options in price. And you may have to construct multiple rosters with different combinations, but you can start looking there. And especially Saturday night and Sunday, I think it's important to look at those ownership projections for running back and try to choose from within that. Again, the high price guys this week, probably Jonathan Taylor is going to be less owned in a tough matchup versus Jacksonville, who we know as a bit of a pass funnel and playing real good defense lately. Achane is still sub 9K, but it's getting up there. He may see his ownership come in under the projections as well. I am going to expect that just as he gets up nearer to 9K and his passing game is kind of drying up a little bit. At least that's the results recently. All right, guys who will be popular this week. I'm going to give you how many times they have made this list, how many times they have been one of the highest owned running backs, and how many times within that they hit. I think these are patterns that I'm starting to make, again, some not decisions based off of, but starting to sort of understand how the field thinks of some of these guys and combine that with what I think and sort of help make decisions or at least rankings and tiers around that. So James Cook, right, has been on this list 4 times. He has hit for a usable score, somewhere above 20 points, 30 points, 3 out of the 4 times. So Cook, it seems like, right, that people get him right. We'll talk about him a little bit later. I'm going to focus on him today. I should have said this at the top of the show. One main focus of today will be the idea, belief. I want to talk about what we mean when we say we believe in something and where is the bias in that. All right, going back to the action steps for running back. Achane has been on this list 5 times. He has never really killed your roster when he's on this list. If you look back through his game logs, that's pretty obvious. But he has only hit 2 out of the 5 times. So again, often Achane is popular, but more often than not, he fails to deliver on that. Bijan Robinson has hit 3 out of the 6 times that he has been on this list. Bijan is always popular, right? He is not super consistent, and it is difficult to know when he is going to hit and when he is not. So he doesn't always sort of go with the matchup. I think the reality with Bijan is at lower ownership, he's a great play because he's hit 50% of the time that he's been on this list. But, he was 63% owned once, and he kind of crushed the field by missing. I would treat Bijan that same way this week, at least sort of overall as a general way of viewing him. Derrick Henry, the field has been sort of on the lower end of the top 10 4 times. He's only hit once. The field is generally leaving Derrick Henry alone, and that might be what we just need to do with him for the rest of this season. At least we know the field is doing that. All right. So those are our 4 players I think we're going to be interested in this week. We're going to need to make decisions on, and how the field sort of thinks about them and how they perform when the field likes them or not gives us an insight into how we can play them. Again, there's lots more to that. I'll talk about James Cook a little bit later specifically. Half the time in this weeks 1 through 13. Actually, I've tracked weeks 3 through 13. I did not pull the data for weeks 1 and 2, early season. So in weeks 3 through 13, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. So I thought 11 weeks. In 6 of those weeks, half the time in 6 of those weeks, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those weeks, the top 2 owned running backs hit for scores that you really needed to have. So in 5 of the last 11 weeks that we have been playing DFS, if you had just rostered the top 2 owned running backs, you would have put yourself in a position to take down a tournament at the running back position. Let that sink in. Shouldn't we be doing that every week at this point? Shouldn't we be rostering at least one lineup in say a 3 max or a 5 max, where we take just the top 2 running backs and put them in? I think that is an actionable way of attacking the running back position on any week. It doesn't mean it's going to hit. It doesn't mean it'll continue to hit at a 50% rate. But it seems like the field has an idea of who these good running backs are. And, when you go back and look at them, many of them were running backs who the OWS community also said, obvious play, guys, stick with this one. All right, so that is the running back position. Again, there's some actionable steps that we can take there to help make those decisions, to help make them easier on ourselves so that we don't have to be sort of up in the air about so many things until Saturday or Sunday. We want to sort of nail down some ideas early on. All right, last week was a very low-scoring week. I do think it's important to look back and to understand the recency bias that will be sort of affecting people this week. The week, at least initially, may look similar. I know we do have at least a few games that are projected to go over 46, 47 points, which is helpful, but there are a lot of low-scoring games that are projected. Last week was low-scoring tournaments. Winners did not even reach 200. There were plenty of value stacks, right, that could get you 4x as a salary multiplier, and those were pivotal because it was lower scoring. There were no 30-point scores in week 13. I guess Bijan Robinson was the lone 30-point score as a running back. There were no 30-point scores away from running back in week 13. The best teams, of course, the best players were on Thanksgiving slate. But again, that's something to think about. We are always looking for 30-point scores. There were none last week. What could happen, right, is again, people may stop looking or maybe more comfortable with those lower sort of median plays rather than trying to look for those ceiling plays. Again, those median plays often show up better in a lot of projection systems as well. And so if people are playing more by projections this time of year, right, as we're sort of getting more into the time when projections are more accurate, when players, or DFS players that have made it this far are generally better and generally use projections. The better players do use projections, I would say. So that will be kind of important to think about going forward. And again, hunting for those 30-point scores, we know where they come from. At least I know where they come from. I've shared that with you guys. So we'll get into that again a little bit later. All right, I've been noticing one bias that is popping up that I think we can again look at as we're about to look through this slate and try to figure out where we can find some tourney winners this week. Let's let bias guide us. And so what is one of the major biases this time of year? Well, I think it's the idea that we know that we have confidence and we know who these teams are. When the reality is that the teams are constantly changing. There is a sweet spot for looking at, fantasy points against per position. But if you go on FTN, that's actually the free stats. They're giving away free stats, how many fantasy points have been scored, per position against each team. There's a reason those stats are free. But in addition, even with the sort of DVOA numbers, the rankings, positional, fantasy points against, and DVOA fantasy points against, right? It makes us feel as if we have some certainty about who a team is and how a team has been performing throughout the year. Let's take Cincinnati, for example. That's a team that we pick on over OWS, for good reason. They have, allowed some of the most fantasy points to tight ends and running backs. So it's, no trick to stack running backs and tight ends against them. And you can look, there have been sort of numerable tight ends that have hit in matchups against Cincinnati. Again, so that's how people normally use this stuff. OWS, we've been using it as well. But let's dig in. Why is this a bias? Well, it's a bias because teams are changing, right? We can't always sort of imagine these teams as static or as content with what they're doing. Indianapolis, for example, let's look at them because as I was looking at fantasy points against, DVOA against, it showed that the Indianapolis Colts are a good team to play wide receivers against, right? That they allow more points to wide receivers, throughout the course of the season than almost any other team has. So I may be looking at, some of the Jacksonville wide receivers, especially, like Jacoby Myers, who's sort of new over there. But let's understand the context as well to this so that we don't get tripped up by a bias. Indianapolis isn't particularly bad at defending the pass, right? When you dig into sort of some of their other statistical numbers against them, in fact, they've been pretty good at limiting explosive plays, or even more so recently. So they're not giving up too many explosive plays. They've just been giving up plenty more attempts against them. This is because they usually have been jumping out to leads and teams are passing, right, to get back in contention. So because of this, they are rated sort of highly. If you look, if you were to look at the opponent rank for a Jacksonville wide receiver, you probably see a pretty high number, meaning that it's an easy matchup. I haven't looked at that quite yet on the DraftKings app, but I will. But right, that's because they've been leading in games, forcing other teams to pass. And actually, since acquiring Sauce Gardner, who fits really well into the scheme that the defensive coordinator Anarumo has developed, that has a little bit more of man-to-man, something that Sauce Gardner can do, right? He can shadow someone, which really helps this Indianapolis defense because they're playing a little bit more man-to-man in order to sort of disguise their defense a little bit. And we know Anarumo, kind of plans a little bit more for each team. So Sauce Gardner has been really great for them. And Indianapolis has been more formidable against the pass. So this is a key example of how DVOA can be misleading, right? Especially against a certain position. Even this late into the season, teams do change. So let's take some action on this, right? How can we use a bias and our recognition of the bias and our understanding that this is a bias that other people are going to be playing with this week? How can we take action? Well, if the Jacksonville wide receivers are going to be highly owned and popular, one way to create leverage is just to avoid them, right? Just to fade them, knowing that they are popular for the wrong reasons or because of a bias that we don't agree with. Okay, well, maybe that's one way of doing it. But if a Jacksonville wide receiver does hit, why might they hit? Well, it's not because Jacksonville is it's not because Indianapolis, is a weak defense and Jacksonville is just able to sort of gain a lot of yards on them, et cetera, et cetera. It's probably because Jacksonville also is trailing a lot of this game and is passing a lot. What does that mean for Indianapolis? Well, Indianapolis usually jumps out to a large lead in the first half. It could be on the backs of their wide receivers, but then they always sort of lean into Jonathan Taylor in the second half. And it could be that Jonathan Taylor would be the obvious bringback when playing a Jacksonville wide receiver, saying, Jacksonville is passing a lot more than they usually do. And that's why Jacoby Myers or Brian Thomas Jr. or whoever, is more valuable this week. Perhaps it's a game stack where we are going to, get a game that shoots out for multiple 30-point scores. In this case, maybe you stack the passing games of both teams and put a Trevor Lawrence up there, to take advantage of sort of that situation. So again, recognize the bias and figure out how you can act on it. We don't want to just be playing Jacksonville wide receivers this week because they look like they have an easy matchup. All right, that was a long intro. The sort of main part that I wanted to talk about this week is about belief. And I get into this because every year around this time in my freshman theology class, we start to think about and look at the idea of faith. And our intro to faith is a discussion on beliefs. The working definition of belief that I use is simply an acceptance of something as true. So beliefs are rooted in truth, right? But often we believe things that are very far from the truth. And bias is really what's operating there and can cloud our thoughts, making an opinion, a wish, a hope look like a fact, right? Making an untruth look like a truth. So in terms of DFS, I want to kind of look at this idea. First of all, the last example, right? Team strengths are static. That's a belief that someone has. Again, that's more just a bias, a quick way of thinking of using a stat, right? They aren't. Well, here's sort of, let's sort of dig into this idea of belief and truth. And let's do this by discussing the Tyrod Taylor play from last week, right? There were competing beliefs last week about this play. One belief said that you are better off sort of leaving quarterbacks, wide receivers, right, alone when a team is not projected for many points, right? That we have a lot of data that says when a team is projected for, I think they were projected for 17 points last week. There's a lot of historical data saying that does not lead to high DFS scores. Okay, right? Because quarterbacks need sort of touchdowns in order to really score points. There was another belief, though, and that, again, the historical data sort of gave that belief credence. It gave it truth. You could say that belief was an acceptance of the truth that, right, low projection, low Vegas totals are not places to go to look for your quarterback. Another belief said that Tyrod Taylor, when stacked with some low-cost, explosive players, could represent the key to the slate. This, of course, involved taking a risk on a player block, which, if it hit, would provide a boost to an otherwise certain roster, or it would be a good starting block, right, for building a bunch of rosters, around a 4-player or 3-player block. And this belief represents a strategy in DFS that says when you can stack correlated plays together, then you only need to get one thing right in order to nail 3 or 4 positions on your roster. And there is truth in that strategy. That strategy wins DFS tourneys. congratulations to a lot of the OWS community who managed to do that last week. It is hard enough trying to make that decision, right, between those two competing truths, that we don't really need to add untruths, as hindsight might suggest. Tyrod Taylor, right, has a good shot at a 4x score. That, maybe that was the thinking the decision that you were making last week about Tyrod Taylor. You heard Tyrod Taylor's name and you say, well, can he put up a 4x score? Well, where is the truth in that belief? Right? Think about it. That is a hope or an opinion, right? A belief that is filled with bias. That's you trying to look at one player and say, this player can reach for 4x. There's a lot of untruth in that. There's as much untruth in that as there is truth. Anyway, last week, Cam Ward was another cheap running back. He got rostered, at a slightly higher rate in most contests than Taylor did. Well, why did that happen? Well, a lot of people thought that his recent play suggested that he could go for 4x his cheap salary. He had faced Seattle and Houston and done well off the bye and was facing a lower rated defense. And so people thought, right, this is rooted, of course, in the recency bias and the narrative that Ward, was moving around better in the pocket, had, picked up some skills over the bye week that were going to, kind of change and affect his play. Again, there's a lot of bias in that. Where are you getting these reports, right? Who is sharing these reports with you? I did a course this year on recognizing biases, part 2, that's in the OWS library or wherever we keep these. And it talks specifically about the information that you take on at the beginning of the season and how to recognize the bias in it, right? And that's still valid as the season wears on. Who's telling you about Cam Ward? Why are you believing it? So I was on that as well. I think I talked about Cam Ward and said the bias is actually going to be not to play him. He's only like 7% owned, but I didn't think he'd be even that owned last week. And that was because I had an opinion about Cam Ward. But I did not play him. And I did not play Cam Ward because I couldn't land on a stacking partner with him. Basically, if I got Cam Ward right at 4x his salary, I got nothing else right. It didn't help me with any other positions on my roster. And that was something I did not want to do. So Cam Ward was a belief. It was based on my evaluation of a player in an NFL game that has tons of variables that are out of my control and ability to evaluate and to predict. So when picking players to add to our roster, what I want to do is I want to incorporate DFS strategies that are rooted in truth. Picking players is rooted in belief that is not an acceptance of the truth, but that is more an opinion that is formed by bias. Right? I want to incorporate DFS strategies that are rooted in truth. Data about DFS strategy or game theory, they don't have this sort of small sample size caveat that an NFL season is. They tell us truth more so than looking at individual players. So let's dive into some of the untruths that are looking like truths this week. And I probably have a controversial one right away because I think this is a great example. So I go on the DK app often at the beginning of the week just to kind of look through the teams that are playing, the matchups, and injuries, things like that, just to kind of get a sense of the slate, help me with my initial thoughts. And one of the prominently displayed factors about a player in a given week, other than their fantasy points per game, their price, the opponent, is the opponent rank. And it's the opponent rank at a certain position based on fantasy points scored against. As I said earlier, this is a free tool at FTN Fantasy. It's free for a reason. There's also a tool there that's a paid tool that's a better understanding, paints a fuller picture. It's called the DVOA, adjusted fantasy points against. But in any metric, Cincinnati is the easiest matchup for running back, lead running backs, making James Cook an obvious target this week for DFS rosters. We believe in this play because of the matchup, right? But let's throw in a competing belief. So we believe in this play because of the matchup. The truth of that matchup, we are relying on past historical data that is a small sample size. So let's throw in a competing belief to see how that sort of holds up or shapes up. Cincinnati had their bye week in week 10. And since their bye week, I think it is only 2 games, or is it 3 games? Well, I'm not sure. Might be 3 games. It is 3 games. They have been more middle of the pack against the run. They faced Baltimore, New England, and Pittsburgh. Baltimore and Pittsburgh have been near the top of the league in their rushing production. New England is not, but that's okay. So we have to question: did Cincinnati fix something on defense over the bye? And how do we choose between these 2 beliefs? These 2 beliefs that look like truths, but obviously, I guess they both could be. One has to be an untruth at this point. Right? Did they fix something, or are they still the easiest matchup? We realize that both beliefs are more opinion based. So what we need to do is we need to look for some deeper truths, right, about James Cook or about Cincinnati, or as JM often says, we need to kind of turn the math in our favor, figure out what types of roster construction and lineups it would benefit us to play James Cook. Do we need bringbacks? Et cetera, et cetera. What types of other people on his team are likely to score highly when he does? Is there any stacks we can build? So one thing is also, right, looking at Cincinnati, they stand out as being poor against running backs and tight ends. So perhaps we could stack James Cook with a Buffalo tight end, right? Especially if Dalton Kincaid gets healthy this week. He'd be a great stacking partner. So that's one way to do it, right? To turn the math in our favor, to get 2 positions right. If it is true that Cincinnati has not really fixed their defense, that they're still bad at both those positions. Well, let's get 2 positions right if we can. We could look at ownership to make decisions, right? I talked about running back ownership earlier, and I realized that increased ownership on a play like James Cook represents some positive trends in DFS in terms of finding and getting the right running back, right? In terms of the field, getting the right running back. If he is high owned, right, that gives me more confidence in James Cook as a play than if he is lower owned. So I want to look at what other people are thinking about James Cook this week. Okay, that's one way to sort of deepen the truth. The reality is I do want to play James Cook this week. I think he was the first person that I put into a sort of skeleton build. But I also know that while I believe he is in a good spot on a good team that really leans on him in good matchups, he may not be a player that wins tourneys. Right? There's lots of things that could happen within a game where he is not the player that I need to take down a tourney. I have a high opinion of him. It is based in bias, but I recognize that, and I will make good decisions when I'm constructing my rosters with James Cook. Right? I'll look for the deeper truths, and I'll look for ways to play him where I have a real shot at first place, and I'll look for ways to create leverage. Right? If he is high owned, and I don't decide to play him. All right. It is generally believed. Kind of want to finish this up, wrap this up about James Cook. It's generally believed that DK prices their players so that they hit 4x their salary about 25% of the time. So if I believe in a player, it could be James Cook, it could be Michael Pittman this week. If I believe in a player and the matchup they face any one week, right? How much do I tilt that math in my favor, right? Does my belief in a player increase that 25% hit rate? Am I that good, right? Some people are better at analyzing players and can sort of pick them better. How much does it increase that rate? How much does it tilt that math in your favor? And how much does something like stacking tilt the math in your favor? How much does avoiding a high-priced running back and stacking a different game, right, tilt the math in your favor? So these are things to think about this week. And it's one of the reasons why at this time of the year, roster construction creates more certainty from a math perspective than player analysis. And it's why we should be diving into roster construction over player analysis as the season wears on. All right. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully we can say, find the difference between believing in someone and having a plus EV way of playing or putting people onto our rosters. All right, so what are we looking for this week? Just a reminder, I did this probably a few weeks ago in order to kind of find my core plays. We are looking for running backs in the top 10 of ownership, right? We are looking for high volume wide receivers, people who are exceeding their volume by a considerable amount. Those are the ones that have been scoring 30-point, have been creating 30-point scores this year. The Jamar Chases, Puka, JSN, right? The high-priced guys that attract more volume. If Michael Wilson is back for, if the Arizona Marvin Harrison Jr. is out and Wilson is the wide receiver one again in Arizona, right? His volume will increase considerably against the Tampa Bay team. Michael Pittman is someone who, and Alex Pierce, right? If Indianapolis is forced to pass more, those are two people who could see big spikes as they have before in volume. Mitchell on the New York Jets is still not priced high enough for the likely volume that he is going to get. And he is, again, someone who can spike for high volume, which is going to make him a good play. Someone like Mitchell is probably better paired with Tyrod because Tyrod's salary, again, is so low. So you can kind of make those correlated pairings as well, sort of increasing your EV right there. We are looking for value plays. I haven't dug into any of those yet, but again, as most people do, we'll do so later in the week, especially if they are needed. What are the had-to-have-it game stacks, right? The few games this year, right? On the main slate, maybe there have been 3 or 4 this year, game stacks, which have really popped for multiple 30-point scores. Are there any game stacks that this week that we can overstack and get multiple 30-point scores from one game stack? It is very rare, but we may be able to get that this week. Or in lieu of a game stack, is there a stack with a high certainty of positions, right, that can hit for 4x, like the New York Jets last week? Are there any stacks like that this week where I can say, yeah, I can get about 3 or 4 positions right with this stack, and there's a good chance this stack can get me 4x. And if it does, I hit all 4 positions here. So I will be looking, right, for these things this week. I will be building my core from these ideas. These are the ideas that vault you to first place. For my had-to-have-it game stacks this week, I will be looking at Chicago at Green Bay. They have a total of only 45, but those are 2 teams where we know that if one of them gets down by a considerable amount, the other one is going to come back throwing with a vengeance, again, possibly leading to a sort of had-to-have-it game stack where those 2 quarterbacks, could both hit for high touchdown totals, yardage, etc. And their partners, right? Their pairing partners are not so highly priced. So we may even be able to look at that game in two ways, right? Stacking with a high certainty of 4x, or a game stack that could, be overstacked and really grab a ton of 30-point scores from that one. That one's a little less likely than the next three. Cincinnati at Buffalo, 53.5 total. I think that one's pretty obvious. Two very high-powered offenses could get going, could produce a game that you had to have in order to take down tourneys this week. Could produce, one of the best games of the year. That's how we have to look at that game, because some of the prices are so high, right? If you're stacking that game, you want to play probably Josh Allen. You want to play Jamar Chase, right? I don't know if you can play Josh Allen and James Cook. Maybe you can. But more likely, right, you're looking at some of the stacking partners with Josh Allen. Again, that's a tough one, but if it scores a ton of points, right, you're going to need to have it. There's the Rams at Arizona. I think obviously, right, that Arizona loves to pass. The Rams have some great wide receivers, so we could see a lot of fantasy points in that one. And Indianapolis at Jacksonville, similar to the Rams at Arizona, 47.5 total. I think that one is one that an overstack, right, could turn out to be the one you had to have. Similarly, right, that we're going up and talking about, well, if people are playing, right, the Jacksonville wide receivers, if they're popular, all right, let's build a lineup with that, but let's overstack that game. I don't think a Jacksonville wide receiver hits alone this week. Some of the value stacks, these are ugly. Just go and look at low team totals with condensed volume. You got the Jets, you got the Saints, you got Miami, right, set to score 19, 17, and 22 points. But they do have condensed volume, and if they end up doing better than that point total, you know who is getting the ball, and you can build value stacks. All right, DFS is not that simple, my friends, but recognizing bias is, and it points us in the right direction. All we need is solid roster construction, a little bit of time to make our decisions, and a little luck on Sunday. So with all of those, I will see you at the top of the leaderboards. And again, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. What else are we celebrating around this time? Other religious festivals and festivities. Blessings to all of you out there.